Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's training. Maybe you are now experiencing a little bit of a surprise at the different voice and the different face. My name is Helen, and I'll be taking us through the material today, reviewing an audit engagement. I'm so glad you could all join us. I know a Friday afternoon is probably the last thing you want to do is attend an audit training, although perhaps some of you feel like I'd rather enjoy some training than be reviewing an audit file. All right, but welcome to today's session. Very excited to have you with us today. First things first, the link has been posted in the chat for the material for today's session, the slides, and then there are two Word documents with some information on which we will go through during the session. And there is also a QR code to scan if you are struggling with the link. It's just obviously then if you're scanning with your phone, you just need to transfer it through to your laptop, or maybe you are watching on your phone and then you're all set. Right. Everyone is muted when they join us because we obviously don't want all the distractions of perhaps if it's like my house, children making some noises, people doing some construction. So everyone is muted when they join. Please do enjoy using the Q&A or the chat function for today, as well as at the top you will see there is a lovely little reaction button. So you can make a little floating reaction on the screen, and then this way I know I am actually not all alone in the room, so to speak, because it is quite something to feel like you are presenting to yourself. So please do participate. It's definitely very energizing, and I think we all could use a bit of energizing on a Friday afternoon. If the signal is lost or you're struggling, please try to exit and re-enter the webinar, and hopefully that helps a bit, as well as you are able to switch off cameras. I will also switch off my camera after I've done my introduction so that we can have a little bit of a smoother presentation. The recording will be made available after the session, so if you miss something, please don't stress. You can go and rewatch the recording, or if you just want to recap something as well, then it will be available. Right, there aren't any polls today, but we do have something very exciting coming up a bit later. So if you are struggling to stay awake, pull yourself together. We will be having a little bit of excitement, a little bit of interaction a little bit later with a quiz for you, and there are possibly, a little birdie tells me, some prizes available. So please do make sure you stay for that, as well as if you do have any questions. It doesn't matter if you feel like your question is a little bit silly. I can guarantee you there are probably a whole lot of other people sitting in this training thinking the same thing as you. Okay, so ask your questions even if you think it's silly. I will not judge you in any way. I find that I learn things every single time I review a file, or I go through the standards again, or someone asks me a question and I have to go check something all over again. I find that I learn something new almost every single time. So please do share your questions, because it is also a lovely training opportunity for me as well as everyone else. The resources for today's session, so the link, as mentioned, has been posted in the chat. That will take you through to this page here. And on this page, you can see the webinar training sessions page for the Get Ahead 2026. And if you scroll on down, you will see there, you will eventually get to audit level 3. And on audit level 3, you will get to the bottom there, the session 3, which is the audit level 3 material. You can click on the link, it will automatically download, and you can open up the documents. Okay. Apologies, I am recovering. So hopefully we are not too disturbed by the coughing today. Okay, on the top, with regard to the questions, on the top bar in your Teams meeting, there will be a Q&A or a chat. So when you want to open up and send those through, just click on that. It'll open the bar on the right-hand side, and you are able to type in your questions. The agenda for today looks quite overwhelming, but I promise it's not. It's just that I have really broken down everything quite a lot. So don't be overwhelmed by what the agenda looks like. But what we are going to go through is why we need to review, which is really not long, people. And then what can we do pre-reviewing that will make our job easier. At this point, also let me say, because we have been running an independent review course. So we are not speaking about independent reviews today. We are speaking about actually reviewing an audit engagement file. So you sitting there reading what someone has written for you and telling you a story. That is what we are speaking about today. So when I talk today about reviewing or a review or performing a review, I am talking about you reviewing an audit file. I'm not speaking about independent reviews. Okay. We are also going to just take a look at the different phases of review. We will go through some tips for reviewing planning, execution, and finalization, as well as what the timing of reviews would be. And then we're going to speak about the victory lap, which is when we're done with our review, but also not quite, because we need to go and do some clearing. And then we will just have a light little touch on engagement quality reviews. Okay, so I'm going to switch off my camera, but you will still hear me. I almost muted myself as I said that. Wouldn't that have been funny? All right, so I'm really going to switch off my camera and not my microphone, and then we can start with the material. Right, so why do we need to review? Also, let me just explain. I do review a lot of audit files. That is my main job. So what is in today's session is also just about giving you the tips and tricks to do the review. I think it is quite overwhelming when you first start reviewing files. You have no idea. And as you get more experience, you do spot more things, you do link more things in the file. So also don't be too hard on yourself if you think back after today's training or after your next file review. Shoot, I did a not so great job on the previous one. We are all learning all the time. I can tell you now that even in my file reviews, someone will do monitoring on my files, or Urba comes along and reviews, and there will still be things that they find. What we do hope is that they don't find something which is indicating we've issued an inappropriate opinion, because that would be super awful. But they will find documentation errors. So no one is perfect. And as you get more experience, you're definitely going to get much better at reviewing, and everything's going to become much easier, and it's not so overwhelming. Okay, so why do we need to review? We need to review because obviously we want to see that the objectives of our audit file are being met. So what's the objective? Well, the objective is that we want to issue an opinion that is appropriate. And that audit file is the evidence which we are gathering to issue that audit opinion. So when we are gathering that evidence, we have objectives also in each section of the audit file. And those objectives will be things like ensuring all the transactions occurred, ensuring everything that should have been recorded has been recorded. So we will raise risks, and based on those risks, we will need particular evidence to meet an objective for that test. And then altogether, all of those objectives will hopefully get us to our main objective of issuing an appropriate audit opinion. The other thing to remember is, firstly, an experienced auditor should understand what we have done on the audit file. So I say an experienced auditor, that is the words in the auditing standards, because it's not just any old person walking down the road that should understand. We don't need to go into that much detail with our audit files, but an experienced auditor who has no experience with the current audit you are busy with should be able to understand what is happening in your working paper and be able to come to the same conclusions. Okay, so that's also what we need to keep in mind when we are reviewing, which sometimes is a bit difficult when you're really in the thick of things, but you are less in the thick of things than someone who has done the actual section. Okay. And then the other part to remember, a very big part to remember, is in our industry, there is a lot of training that happens. So we have less experienced team members. So team members who have not been auditing for a huge amount of time. Sometimes they are straight out of school. Sometimes they are fresh out of varsity coming to us. Some still studying, wherever they are in their journey. The point is they are new to the practical aspects of auditing. So what is very important when we are reviewing is also to remember the experience level of the people that we are reviewing, right? Because we want to make sure they don't have the understanding that we would have as experienced reviewers. And so even if you are not an experienced reviewer, you might be a third year or a manager or a supervisor, even partners. And so we got to remember the level of the person whose work we are reviewing in order to make sure that we read it with the understanding that they don't have all that experience and knowledge that we have just yet, is what I will say, because they will get there. But at this point, we also just need to remember that we are a training industry, and so we have to review and make sure the evidence is on point. Right, then you see that cute little icon over there. That is a mountain with a hot air balloon. And if any of you have encountered me before, and my favorite thing to say when reviewing files is that as a reviewer, you are trying to get above the forest, or in this case, the mountains. So we are trying to look at the file with a bit more of a wider view. So we are looking at a whole story, so the whole mountain range, if you will, and we are trying to see if it all makes sense and ties in together. And the other thing about being higher than the mountain, so everyone's on the mountain, busy chipping away at the mountain, which is the audit. But we're trying to fly in the hot air balloon so that we can ensure that the chipping away is doing what it needs to do and that it makes sense. I don't know if you, well, actually, I got a great example for you. So when you're typing on your phone and you're typing someone a story, and then there will be a suggestion for an autofill. And sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, often the autofill is just completely down the wrong road. But that autofill is what happens to everyone on the mountain in an audit. So they will write a sentence or a story and they will think, great, this makes perfect sense. But when you read it, you don't have the autofill they do because they have a background story and you do not. And so what you are understanding from their sentence is not what they're understanding. So you, in the hot air balloon, are able to say, listen, I see you down there on the mountain, but I need you to actually tell me, what is your path? What are you busy chipping away at now? Because I'm not understanding your story. All right. I was laughing with someone earlier and I said, you see their little, the hot air balloon there is in the mountains and it's about to crash. Because I wanted to say also an EQR, so any external reviewer or even the partner, or the manager, if you've got a manager level that doesn't also do audit procedures, there are different heights of the balloon. So someone who is completely external, hasn't looked at the file at all, hasn't been involved, doesn't know the client, that is the highest level of the balloon. And they have the widest view, and they are the ones that probably need or are going to be able to give a lot more queries about, please fill in this information for me, because they have absolutely no autofill. And then the lower levels have a small amount of autofill. Even the partner, they have a good understanding of the client you're auditing. So they still will have some autofill happening, even if they're not ticking and bashing there next to the team. All right. So yeah, overall, what we're trying to do is in our hot air balloon, make sure that everything actually makes sense. Right. What can we do pre-review? So what can make our review job a little bit easier? Well, what you can do is check in with the team regularly. So when you check in with the team regularly and you don't just leave them to their own devices for the whole extent of the audit, what is happening is they will be able to tell you where they're having a hard time. You will be able to guide them. You will be able to say, rather do the test this way, and you will save time by actually putting in more time. if I can put it that way. So that regular check-in really makes a big difference to the quality of the file you're going to get when you start your review. Also, brief the team in full. So give them the story that they need to do what they need to do. So if they are doing trade receivables and there's important information you need to tell them that information. Give them what they need to do their job. And if they are, also keep in mind when you are doing this, what level you are briefing. So if I'm trying to brief someone who has very little experience in audit, I'm going to be very specific about what they are required to do. You are going to do this section. This is what you're going to do. These are the tests you're going to do. This is what I want you to do. This is when I want you to check in. Let's go through one together. Now go off on your own. If you have any questions, ask me as you go. Okay, so those things will definitely save you time. I know it seems counterintuitive. It seems like I'm going to put in more time and I'm going to have to review. You're not getting to the same point in those two different scenarios. When you brief fully, when you check in regularly, when you ask your team questions, you are going to get a better quality at the end to shorten your review time. Then in terms of asking questions, what I mean by that is make sure that you don't just go in and say, team, how's everything going? And they all go, everything's fine. That's not a proper check-in. So when you ask the question, you say, okay, what are you busy with? How is it going? Have you done X, Y, and Z in that test? Have you encountered any problems? Are there exceptions? Are you getting the information you need? Those sorts of things will also get you to those. You all know when you've gotten to a working paper, for instance, and it's got tons of notes on it, and you just think, oh, now I've got about 100 stories to read. And then you read the stories, and we actually didn't meet the objective of the test based on those stories. Hopefully, if you can get to the question before that point, you are going to solve it, not only to save yourself review time, but you are going to solve it so that you don't have to go back and redo a test or ask for more information. Okay, you're not always going to get this right, everyone. You're not always going to be able to ask the right question or get the right answer. And sometimes you're still going to look at that working paper and think, wow, I was sure I went through this with this person. It's never going to be 100% smooth sailing, but that's okay because you will still save time where it is possible to save the time. All right, the phases of reviewing. And in case this was a surprise to everyone because you thought the only phase applicable was when everyone is finished the audit, the phases of reviewing consist of the planning, execution, and the finalization. So that pretty much falls in line with how an audit runs. But what is important to mention here is when the planning is done, you should review the planning and just think about the implications of that. When you review the planning and you see we've missed a risk or the procedure that we've planned to address a risk is not actually going to address the risk, you can change it if you've done it before they have full on gone through the whole execution of the audit. When you get to a point where we're now finished the file, supposedly, told the client we're done, and now we're reviewing and realize we've gone down completely the wrong road, it's very difficult to go back and change that. Go back and change it, you must, okay? But it is a difficult road to walk. So save your time, yourself the time, trouble, and also review the planning when the planning has been done. In terms of execution, review as the team goes. All right. So I know it's difficult sometimes to get to this, but it definitely is much more worth it to try to review as they finish sections instead of reviewing only at the end of the audit, which is both overwhelming and difficult to get through in a short amount of time. If you are like me, I try to, or I prefer to have shorter, very intense times of review and then go and do some other tasks, because the amount of focus and reading that is involved with reviewing an audit file is very intense. And so I just need to give my brain that little bit of break. And also, while in the background while I'm doing another task, there are problems that I've noted on the file busy simmering for how can I make this, or what do I need to do? Not how can I make this work, but what can I do that will address this problem that I have? All right. Apologies. So, and then finalization, we're obviously going to, at the end, before signing the audit report, we are going to review the final parts of the file. So you won't get to every bit of execution during the execution. There will be some parts that the team will be back in office or off the audits by the time you finish the execution and review the finalization. All right, but just to emphasize, there is more than one phase. And then obviously there's the clearing part of reviewing, which is clearing the file throughout. Right, in terms of reviewing the planning, I have a few tips for you today. So number one is review with purpose. And what I mean by that is read everything with the thought in your mind that you're trying to understand what is happening in this client and what the team have been doing in this client. So review with purpose. Don't just review because you have to read the document and sign it off. That is not a review. That is you reading the document to sign it off. Reviewing with purpose is reviewing with an understanding of what am I trying to achieve on this document. So let's say the document is client acceptance and I need to make a decision about whether I can accept the client. When I'm reviewing the document, I need to keep this in mind and keep in mind what is popping up throughout that, as well as the fact that even at the acceptance phase, I am able to identify certain risks that are going to arise during the audit. Things like the discussion with those charged with governance. Those discussions are often just something we read and we move on. I can't tell you how many times in there, the client has said something to us which will impact something, not necessarily a risk, but it's something we need to think about later. And what is written on the audit comment or the auditor's comment is noted. But it's something that's actually important, might affect our work, maybe something we need to ask a bit further about. So review with purpose. What we will ask ourselves when doing this is, do the answers to the steps reflect a story, or are they just a response to nothing? And incorporated into that point is the story being told for this client for this year? So your planning, while there will be a lot of standard sentences or responses to things, it should not be the same for every single audit client because every single audit client is not the same. And what I'm trying to achieve when I'm doing the planning for this client is telling the story of this client and what this client is all about for this year, which affects my audit. In terms of the answers to the story reflecting a response and not just a say nothing, that would be at the times where, for instance, you are reading a response to the question. Let's say the question is, I'm trying to think of a good example that I always have a problem with. Does the client have an appropriate control environment? And we write, the client has an appropriate control environment. But that sentence doesn't tell me how we know the client has an appropriate control environment. It doesn't tell me about the control environment. What it says is it's just a statement confirming what the question is, which is not something that's going to indicate that we've done our planning appropriately. Next, did we gather evidence of the story being told? So planning, there is a very big emphasis and a very big need to understand that planning is an evidence gathering exercise. So it is not that we are, apologies, it is not that we are just writing sentences. We also need to explain how we came to the conclusions we came to. Remember that auditor sitting in the hot air balloon wants to understand if you're saying we have a good control environment, how do you know that? What made you conclude that we have a good control environment at this client? So did we gather the evidence for the story being told? So what I mean by that is you don't need to, for every single sentence in the planning, identify that this clerk has, or the person doing the planning has gotten a piece of paper or done a test. But we do need to feel like someone went and did something beyond write a sentence. Anyone can write a sentence. I can tell you now, when I've put together a training course on a caseware file, I can go and fill in whatever story I like. But I don't have evidence to back up that story because it's all fake, because I'm doing it for the purpose of the training. We don't want that to be the feeling at the end of our reading of the planning documents. What I would also say here is follow references when identified. So often, for instance, on the acceptance document, we will reference out to our ethical considerations and the team declarations. Follow that reference through to that document when you get there. Because to try to remember everything that has been referenced or needed from one document to the next can be quite overwhelming and difficult. So it is better to rather just follow that reference through. And you can do one of two things at this point. You can follow it through and see that it is there, and I'm going to get there when I get to my review. Or you get there and you review it and you come back to the document you were busy with. All right. And in this way, we're also going to make sure that things that are referenced are actually on the file. While reading the story of the planning, we are also going to think about, does this story indicate that there's some risks about at the client? And also from this understanding, I'm going to ask myself, what risks do I expect to see? So when you tell me already this client is in the manufacturing industry, I'm already going to start thinking about overhead allocation being a problem, the classification between expenses and cost of sales. I'm going to think about work in progress problems. If you tell me they also do, let's say, food, I'm going to start worrying or thinking about the impairment of inventory, for instance. And so as the story unfolds, as I'm reading more of those planning documents and understanding more of the story, I either want someone to make me feel better about my concerns with this client, or I want to see a risk raised and I want to see us go and do something about that risk. So that's what I mean by what risks do we expect to see when we are reading the story. And then also follow the track. So if a risk is indicated, then follow it through to your risk document. So if I see, oh, we should have a risk raised for something, go to the where we raise the risks, or your risk report or your 1160, whichever methodology you are using, and go and see, has the risk actually been raised that we identified? Because by the time you get to those documents, you are not going to remember what you have read in document 1, which could have been 2 or 3 days ago. All right. Also, when you follow through that risk, please check, has it got the correct description? So is the description in the risk telling the same story from where I just identified this risk? Is the assertion that is ticked correct? And is the rating correct? So what I mean by assertion is, often we'll find that the description of the risk will say something along the lines of, we concerned that the client will record revenue at the incorrect in the incorrect period. But then what gets ticked is occurrence. But that's non-occurrence risk. That's a cutoff risk. So what we're concerned, the description of the risk and what we're concerned about should tie in also with the assertion that has been ticked. And then the rating should be appropriately assessed. So the likelihood and magnitude or monetary impact, that should be appropriately assessed. And we should just check it while we're there. No need to run around and come back to it later. And remember, when you're following references through, you're not creating more work for yourself. You're actually saving yourself time, because now you know I've already reviewed this little section of this document, so I don't need to re-review it. Okay. And then also just make notes as you go. So as someone who reviews files, often what I have is something called a concerns document. It's not necessarily always concerns. Sometimes it's filled with reminders, but I will write down things that I find important. So things when someone says the client will aim for a GP percentage of 25%, I will go, okay, I'm going to write this down, because I want to remember when I'm now looking at the analytical, or when I'm looking at finalization, or I'm looking at the testing that's in revenue or cost of sales, that this information that I've written in the planning ties up with that information. And if it doesn't, then why not? And it's also just a good way. You are never going to be able to remember everything all at once. But if you write yourself these key little notes, you will then, as you're going through the file, just keep going through your notes to go remind yourself of those important points. What is very helpful with these notes is if you split it into sections. So sometimes there will be a general section. So it might say, I don't know, something about laws and regulations, or the client created a new plant, but maybe you also can link that to multiple sections. And then there will be things like revenue, where if there's something in the planning that it says something specific about revenue, I will write it under the revenue little section of my notes document. And then I will remember when I get to the revenue section, I will go and check those notes specifically. And it's a really helpful reminder and a way not to get lost in the file, if I can say that. Okay, then ensure documents are completed in full and with sense. Again, the documents have a purpose. They are not just there to fill in some words. There is a purpose to all of the documents in your methodology, in your software. So it's important to make sure they are completed in full and with sense. So what they have written makes sense in the context of what we are trying to understand. And the sentence isn't just a repeat of the question. Follow risks to the system description. So as we know, if we have raised a risk on our audit file, that section must have a system description. So as you get through your risks, go and double check in the file, have we got a system description? What I would say at this point is, maybe at this point, you don't necessarily read the full description, but I will also just comment on that in a moment. But maybe at this point, you don't read the full system description, but you make sure it is there to ensure the completeness of your audit file. Right. In terms of reading it there and then, what I prefer to do is I prefer to leave the system description to read when I get to the point of reviewing that section, because it's really important for me that I understand the section I'm reviewing when I get there. And if I read 10 different system descriptions at the planning stage, I'm not going to remember that information when I get to the section. And then I'm not going to make sure that my system description actually ties in with what my testing is telling me. And so there might be a disconnect there. You can do it, and in some cases you might also want to just check this little part that I'm going to speak about now, which is the significant risk part. Where there is a significant risk, we are required to do a design and implementation test for the controls over that significant risk. In that instance, it might be also, again, here from my own personal experience, I do not go and read the whole D&I test at this point, but I do make sure that one has been done, because we are required to do this for significant risk sections. And if it isn't done at all, then I will go and remind that person to do it. When looking at the significant risk sections, and specifically the design and implementation test, what we do need to pay attention to is the D&I needs to address the control over the significant risk. So if my significant risk is occurrence of revenue, my control, which I am looking at in the design and implementation test, is the control that the client has, which addresses the occurrence risk that I'm concerned about. The implementation test must be the implementation test of that control, which is also a very common problem. Is the implementation test, what I often see on files, is an implementation test that is what our audit procedure would usually be. And in the case of a lot of files, we often will do a substantive audit approach, and we won't actually cover a control. But in the case of a significant risk, we must evaluate whether the control will prevent or detect and correct the misstatement we are concerned about. And we must ensure that that control is there. So we must do the implementation test. But note that I said that control, and we are talking about the client's control. So it cannot be our audit test, especially if we are doing a substantive test, because that doesn't address the control. So there needs to be the link between the implementation test and the control. So when we are reviewing that D&I, we must be able to draw the link between the two. From the system, well, not the system descriptions, apologies, from the risks. So after I've taken a look at the risks and I've made sure, cool, my system descriptions are there, my D&I is being done, I will then follow through to the audit plan and strategy, and I will double check what is the procedure we're going to do? What are we going to do about this risk? Is it going to be the right thing that we are going to do? And obviously, when looking at the audit plan and strategy, we should make sure we have addressed the material classes of transactions, account balances, and disclosures that have no risk. So in those instances that we do our stand back, and here's where you are going to participate in the execution of this planning. You are going to participate by going, did I identify anything when reading the story which makes me believe that actually we do have a risk in a material section that my team has identified no risk for? And then we will go back and raise the risk. Why? Because the difference between if I raise a risk, I need a system description. If the risk is significant, I go to a D&I. And when I have a material balance that I select an assertion for testing, technically I'm not required to have a system description, although in most cases I will often see one because we want to still understand the material section and what is the appropriate assertion that we are selecting for testing. Once I have usually done the audit plan and strategy is to review the audit program. So remember what I'm trying to promote and get you guys to do is to review the planning before there's a significant amount of execution done in this audit. And what that also entails is just a quick review of the audit program to ensure that the procedures that we are going to actually perform in the audit do address the risks that we have raised at the planning stage. Because if we're not going to address the risks that we are supposed to be addressing, what is the point of doing that procedure? Right, so we're going to get inefficiencies, we're going to get a lack of evidence, we're not going to meet our objective if we're not actually addressing the risks on the file. Just as a general point, significant judgments need to be explained and they need to make sense. So what is helpful is when we have a reviewer that is a few steps out from the audit team, and that's not to say the audit team cannot review each other or indeed themselves. Remember, the first step of any review is to review yourself, perform a self-review of your work and make sure your working paper actually says what you have done and tells the story that you need it to tell. But what is really beneficial when it's someone reviewing that does not sit and do the audit work is they can also think about or assess whether the documents and the story actually make sense. Significant judgments are a big deal. So if I can't understand why someone made a judgment call on the file, why did you conclude in this way? Why are we happy with the client's number for this estimate? Then that means that the significant judgment is not adequately explained. And so we need to go back and go, cool team, please can you go back? Can you relook at this? And often in these scenarios, you will find the team has done work, but the work they have done isn't enough. Well, I don't want to say it isn't enough. The work they have done is not reflected on the working paper. And so it looks like it's not done, but they've done it. They just didn't adequately document it. And that's an important thing that we need to make sure of when we're reviewing audit files. And as well as the fact that evidence gathered is clear as well as detailed. And what I mean by detailed, if you look at the bottom of the slide there, when someone says we inspected minutes, that's all well and good, but that doesn't actually get me to what minutes. Was it the right minutes? Did you go and review minutes between the security company and the client, which isn't going to tell me about the control environment? You get what I'm saying. So instead of writing inspected minutes, what I expect and what is needed on the file is, for example, inspected the minutes of the directors' meeting held on 27 February, where the agenda included a discussion of business risks. Okay, so that tells me they inspected directors' meeting minutes. They inspected it near the end of the year, if I've got a year end of Feb. And we looked at the agenda, and definitely there was business risks discussed in that meeting. And so we've done verification. I can also understand what this person has done and exactly what they have inspected. And that is very important to make sure is on the audit file. Okay, so then I have two quick examples that we are going to go through. So you would have seen in the material that you received for today, there are two Excel documents. Excel. There are two Word documents, and that is an extract from the accounting estimates working paper, as well as extract of system description on revenue. I have made it obviously, I want to say neutral, because we are not specifically discussing our methodologies in this training session until we get to the breakout, but it's neutral. That's why it's just a Word document. So if we open up the one about accounting estimates, everyone, you will see it is just a very basic, very enjoyable, I'll say, enjoyable document, this one. I'm sure it's everyone's favorite document to review, the write-up about how the client does estimates. But what I want to show you here is just an example of a few problems that we will often encounter. And I think we'll often read something and think, okay, well, it says this. I guess that's okay. But if we review with purpose, then we would understand what changes we actually need someone to make. So here we have an extract from the accounting estimates working paper for the section PPE. And we know that that usually starts with what are the requirements of the framework. And this person has written the IFRS for SMEs accounting standard requires PPE to be measured using cost or revaluation. The client has selected the cost model. Subsequent measurement requires the recording of depreciation, which is recognized as an expense. And I'm sure a lot of you are nodding along because you are like, this is what we see on our files. And then we've got the next point, and it says method or model applied, and it says management uses the straight line method. Okay, that's awesome. Assumptions applied, then they have some further waffle. That is correct. I actually wrote further waffle on this document. And then the data used, management estimates useful lives and residual values for the calculation of depreciation. And then when it got to retrospective review, this person's written to perform depreciation testing. So we're not going to do the retrospective review. So maybe if we're not reviewing with purpose, this all looks legit, right? But in our document, when we are looking at accounting estimates, what we want on the audit file is for someone to give us enough information to understand how management came up with their estimate, what did they do, what did they use, and then establish, are there any risks arising from that? So if we look at this Word document, nothing in this document is actually telling me much about how management does the assessment of useful lives and residual values. So this is not, if I were to review this with purpose and understand the objective of the document and understand what I'm trying to achieve, this document is not going to be sufficient for me to achieve my objective. So firstly, when we talk about estimates, the requirements of the framework, this is all is the requirements of the framework. But what am I trying to talk about? Firstly, the estimates that I'm talking about in PPE is useful lives and residual values. That's what I want to talk about. That's what I want to know about. Yes, there are requirements in the framework. Useful lives are, etc., required to be done like this. Residual value, this is what it's supposed to be. That's all I need to know. I do not need the whole standard to be written on the working paper because it's not serving any purpose. It's wasting the clerk's time because they're typing it out. It's wasting a reviewer's time, the first level of review, because they're reading a story that's unnecessary. It's wasting the next reviewer's time. And is it actually giving us to what I'm trying to achieve on the document? No. So it's not of any value. So what does need to be spoken about here is what the estimate is, what is the requirement for the framework. The method or model applied, it's not technically wrong. Cool, straight line method is a method, but is it telling me the method management uses to come up with the estimate for useful lives and residual values. What I want to see there and what I need in order to establish if there's risk or not is the way management establishes the useful life is they go and look at the historical useful life of similar assets, and they will establish whether they sold it earlier than expected or later than expected, and they adjust the useful life to be an appropriate number. That's what I want to know, is how does management do it? When we get to the assumptions applied, we usually get also another lot of information that might not necessarily be getting to what I need. So what I do need someone to tell me when I'm looking at useful life residual values estimate, the assumptions applied should tell me what does management assume is going to happen. In the case of looking at historical assets, they have assumed that we will use the new asset in the same way and for the same length of time as I used the old asset. And by someone telling me this information, I can go, cool, is that a valid assumption? Does that assumption give rise to any risks? The data used. Yes, they do use useful lives and residual values to calculate depreciation, but the data used here is what do they use in their estimate? Where do they get the information about the historical assets? They are probably going to their old fixed asset registers. So now I can go, cool, they are basing it on the fixed asset register. Do I normally have a problem with the fixed asset register when I come to the client? Am I always the one going, client, you've missed 3 transactions that have happened in the GL are not sitting in your fixed asset register? And from that, I can then go, cool, in my estimates working paper, the data used is the fixed asset register. Do I now actually have a risk for the estimate of useful lives and residual values? Because I know every year my client doesn't do the fixed asset register properly. In terms of the retrospective review, the reason we're doing it here is because we want to see how accurate management's estimate is. So without actually performing it here, and the way we can do it here is to go, have we had adjustments to depreciation previously? Have we got massive profit or loss during the year for any assets that were disposed of? Without there being a valid reason like, oops, there was an accident and really we didn't expect to have to write off the asset at this point. So that retrospective review tells me about my estimate that is being made, how accurate management has been previously, and therefore the objective of the document, is there a risk in my estimate? So when we review with purpose and understand what's going on and what we are trying to look at in the document, we will be able to give some very good review notes here and get to a better quality product and something which is going to make sure our audit opinion is less likely to be wrong, and we're going to achieve our overall audit objective. Right, let's go through example number 2. So if you open up the document that talks about system description, so that example of system description, you'll see I also took some shortcuts when I typed up this example for you, but it has what it needs for our little example. So in the system description, the clerk has written, I'm the clerk, everyone, in case you were confused. Helen has written, orders are captured by the sales team. A picking list is created, which is used to put aside the goods in the warehouse. Once the picking is performed, the picker will mark the list as complete, and then so-and-so will create an invoice. And then a loading sheet is done and the invoice is generated. Okay, so let me just pause there. So firstly, orders are captured by the sales team. My first question is, where do the orders come from and where are they captured? Are they captured on a post-it that gets given to the picker? Are they captured in the system? Is there a record of the orders? How do we know an order came through? Okay, so I don't have a full story here. From sentence 1, I'm struggling with a sentence. And especially if I have a completeness risk, this system description, with the way it is currently written in that first 2 sentences, isn't telling me where my possible starting point of the transaction is. Okay. In addition, when we say, okay, the picking is performed, and the picker will mark the list as complete, and then so-and-so creates an invoice. But then how does it go from picker marking a list to this person who's creating the invoice? Is there a link? Is it on, again, is it on the system? Do they notify this person and this person raises the invoice and it's automatically linked to the order or the picking list? Is there a link between all of the documents in the process? And I need to understand these things to understand what could go wrong in the process to identify risks as well, which is, if you'll remember when I was talking about, you can read the system description at the point when you're doing the actual section review or in the planning. The risk of doing it the way I do it, which is at the point of reviewing the section, is that I pick up a further risk when I now read the system description. Okay. But whichever way is going to work for you, you'll also know your firm, your clerks, your staff, what goes wrong between system description and the actual audit work, and where is it best to review the system description. Right, so then I want us to just skip to this next paragraph, which is the pricing is determined by the standard price list, which is updated annually. Prices are inputted into the system. Annually at the management meeting in January, the price increases are discussed and approved by the management team, made up of these 4 people. Once the price increase is approved at the meeting, an email is sent from this person to the IT manager. All other management are CC'd, so they are aware of the price changes as discussed in the meeting, and the price increase is then loaded onto the system with an effective date as day 1 of the new financial year. All right. And then we've got a little talk about, or a little write-up of what's happening with the credit notes. So then the walkthrough performed. So in this entity, my methodology requires us to perform a walkthrough, because remember, walkthroughs are not always required to perform. So they're not required in terms of the auditing standards, although it is, I will say, suggested. But a lot of methodologies will often require a walkthrough to be performed. And so in this methodology, I decided the walkthrough shall be performed, and we selected an invoice from the GL and agreed the details to the POD. So that's usually what we would do with an audit step, right? But in the instance of this system description, that's a very short walkthrough. What happened to the order? What happened to the picking list? What happened to the person with the invoice? What happened to the loading sheet? What happened to, well, we've got in there something about a POD. What happened to, we sort filed by whoever. So this little walkthrough isn't a walkthrough of the system. What that is a usual test we would do when we are auditing. So that doesn't achieve the objective. Remember, the objective, again, of a walkthrough is to verify what someone has told us in the system description. It is to see, it is almost like an implementation test for a system description, but a walkthrough is not just about controls. A walkthrough is about the whole process, the whole system. Okay, so then let's move on to the next part that I want to show you is a problem. So here we have a little write-up, so feel free to highlight yours in red to just draw attention to the fact that in this scenario, our significant risk identified was occurrence and accuracy of revenue. So we have particular concerns about the occurrence and accuracy of revenue. And we know that when we have a significant risk, we are required to do a design and implementation test. So if I were to try and now follow my occurrence and accuracy through to my D&I, what the current documentation says is I selected an invoice from the GL and agreed the details to the POD, including the price. So basically what they have done is they have agreed the invoice and the POD, and they've agreed all the details between those 2 documents. But what is missing here is that doesn't test the control. Again, that's just the audit procedure we would perform. So if we were to test the control, what would we expect this person to have done? Well, from the second paragraph, we can see the pricing is determined by standard price list, updated annually. The prices are in the system. So my first control is the prices are in the system, which means staff cannot edit the, well, I don't know, maybe they can edit the price, but the first stop is the price is in the system. So it should come up automatically when someone is raising an invoice of the client. So what do I want to see? I want to see, can someone edit that number? Can they edit the price? Can someone edit the price list? Does it come up in the system or does it not come up? Does the latest price list agree to what was discussed in the meeting in January, the price that was approved by the management team. So does that agree to what is on the system currently? That is the control that is there. That is the control we should be looking at that addresses the accuracy of our revenue, right? So that's what we should be looking at, what we should be testing in our D&I is, does that help the accuracy of revenue? Yes, those various controls. So it's not the whole system, everyone. It is the controls, like there's a management meeting approving the prices. Though that is sent via email to the IT manager. The IT manager is putting it in. And then hopefully, again, I would send the clerk a review query to say, can the staff edit the number when it comes up on the invoice they are generating? And then we also know there's another control there if they cannot edit it. And then the implementation test for that control would be they went and looked at the system and watched someone raise an invoice and they were unable to adjust the price. So those are the things we want to see in the D&I. But as you can see from this working paper, what has been done is not sufficient to meet the objective of this D&I test. We are not addressing the occurrence and accuracy in this D&I test. We are not looking at the controls that should have been extracted from the system description and actually tested or assessed. All right. I think it is a good time for a 10-minute break. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we are going to start taking a look at the review of execution. All right, so I will see you at, I'm really struggling now with the time. I will see you in 10 minutes. Enjoy your break. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you to my lovely assistant, Ioane, for making sure we all knew what time to get back. Um, Feel free, everyone, to let us know the zombie apocalypse has not yet started, and use your little reaction button so we know you are still alive out there. Uh, all right. I'm going to switch off my camera again, just making sure you are all back. Feel free to let us know you're back, people. I'm just teasing you. Okay, so now we are going to go through the reviewing of the execution. Again, just some tips to help us along with, I think it's probably the most overwhelming. Well, I don't know about you. I find the planning probably overwhelming because I like to solve puzzles, and the planning section for me is a story and not the puzzle. It is part of the puzzle, and it's the division of pieces, and it's telling me what pieces may be missing or what pieces may be difficult to place, but it's not as exciting for me as reviewing the actual audit work, which is more of a puzzle for me. And clearly, if I'm so excited about auditing, I do really enjoy working with the numbers and trying to solve the puzzle and seeing what went wrong and seeing the recons. So it's a little bit more interesting or exciting for me than the planning, but the planning is a very much a necessary evil, everyone. Right, so when we get to the review of execution, what we should start with is what is the risk? So what was the risk that we identified in the planning section that we are trying to address now? And this is because what is the risk will lead us to what do I expect to see? So if my risk was occurrence of revenue, what do I expect to see done in the revenue section? I expect them to have tested, the team to show me the testing for how we know that transactions have actually happened. I will then go and review my system description, and in my system description, I will pick up how I could tell that a transaction has occurred. Oh, there are signed PODs. So then I will expect in my testing that I'm going to find testing to a signed POD as proof that a transaction has occurred. If my risk is accuracy, I expect to see testing, which will tell me, for instance, if it's revenue again, how do I know the value of that sale is correct? I went and agreed it to the standard price list. And from my implementation test, which is giving me also comfort in my actual testing, I'm also, if I haven't done it in the implementation test, I surely must do it in the testing of the section to verify that the price list on the system is the correct price list approved at the beginning of the year, and that is what is charged on the invoice I'm testing. Okay, so the what is the risk should lead me to what do I expect to see, because I should have some expectations at the point when I get to the execution based on what I've read in the planning and then based on my reading of the system description. From there, we take a little side road. We do a little yield, we take a little turn, take the slipway, everyone. And what you're going to do on the slipway is make sure that if we are doing something, for instance, like sampling or selecting items for testing, we would select in line with our methodology. So if we are doing sampling, we're doing the sampling in terms of the methodology. If we're selecting specific items for testing and working out coverage, we've done that. You get what I'm saying. So have we done the selection in line with the methodology? Did we start at the right place? So did we start, if we wanted to select from the GL, we started at the GL. If we started from the sales invoice listing, have we done something appropriate for that source, the invoice listing, to make sure it is complete and accurate? Even with the GL, is there some way we've tested it through the audit that we know it is complete and accurate? So we will check what was the source of the testing. Is it the right place we should have started? How do we know our population was complete? Is it the right population for the test we are going to perform? If I'm testing occurrence of my revenue, and let's say I decide I'm going to take it out the GL account, I know that the GL account is the right place to start for the occurrence test. Okay, I can't start at the orders. That's probably going the wrong direction. It's not, orders are not necessarily what is recorded in the system. And then the other part of what I'm going to check before I even get to the point of reviewing the actual work that is performed is what were the number of items that we were supposed to test. And you will be shocked at how many times the number of items we should have tested and what we have tested doesn't quite tie up. So that's very important that we take the little side road, check first, did we select in line with methodology? Is it the right place that we started at? Do we need to check the completeness and accuracy? How do we know the population is correct at the right place? And what is, or have we tested the right number of items? And when we talk about number of items, we're talking also checking that that number of items is the right number in terms of the methodology calculation. Okay. And then we start with, do our audit steps address the risk? So when we go and check, we should have checked this already at the planning, but you also never know what changes between now and then, is just to check, do my audit steps address my risk? So if I must check, usually what will happen, well, there's one of two things that happen. On the working paper, which we're going to review, the team will either write the audit steps there, or it's going to be in our audit program, right? And we will check, cool, occurrence, what do I expect to see? I expect to see something that tells me about the PODs. Do I see PODs mentioned in the audit steps? Yes. And you would be surprised, it's a very simple step, and you could assume it's correct, but you would be surprised at how many times our standard steps are left in the audit program or on the working paper. The standard steps are performed, and that doesn't give us, for instance, where a client has a specific thing that proves occurrence. Let's say let me think, shipping documentation instead of a signed POD, if they exporting, for instance. Our usual standard steps don't often tailor enough. They are not enough for the odd system or the system outside of our norm. So if we're always auditing clients with PODs and we get the client that we need the export documentation or a signed contract, you would be shocked at how many times we haven't gone to that signed contract or the audit, the shipping documentation. So it needs to be that you just double check, are we going to get there with the steps we've performed? When we're reviewing the working paper, we should check that the descriptions are as expected. Okay, so when you open up that working paper and you see the source, for instance, is General Ledger, and we know the General Ledger has a specific format for that description. When we look at the description in the working paper, is the description correct? So does it tie in with what we have seen in the GL if we said we're choosing from the GL? And is that consistent across the whole selection? Or is there something that's standing out there that looks really odd? And why is that? And that's all part of making sure that the test was performed appropriately. Then we're going to check the dates. So any dates on the working paper, do the dates make sense, for instance? And then I've put a little asterisk next to spread over the period, because if we're doing something like sampling, does the sampling make sense that the spread is over the whole period, or is it clumped together in one area? But again, I've put the asterisk because it really does depend also on your sampling methodology. So perhaps it is monetary unit sampling, and there happen to be a very high value month, and so most of the sample is in 1 month. And that happens to be the massive transactions, then it's not necessarily that we're going to have a spread over the whole period, but we should ensure that the sample is appropriate to what we're doing and the selection was appropriate. Then we're going to compare the dates of the documents or the transactions, the dates of the transactions we selected for testing with other dates that are on the document. So for instance, if I am testing occurrence of revenue, I know I keep repeating myself, it's probably just the easiest example at this point. And I'm going to select, I'm going to examine or inspect, review the date of the transaction versus the date of the POD. what I would definitely advise is for the actual date to be written on that working paper. So sometimes we have testing blocks, and the blocks are a little like grid with the tick mark in. So it just has a tick that says, did we establish that the transaction happened, and it's got a little tick. What I would say is I would probably then edit my working paper to make sure the date is actually reflected. Because the other thing that you can do with this test is also ensure that there's no possible cutoff problem that will pop up, firstly. Secondly, you can double check that this person has actually ticked correctly. And if they're forced to write the date, they're going to consider it better than if they just do a tick. Just think about how much has to go into the typing. And it seems like it's going to waste time, but it's actually going to save you risk. All right. And then also just the dates, check that the format is correct. So I usually do a quick test. These working papers are usually in Excel. So when reviewing, I will just take the one date, the transaction date minus the date of delivery, for instance, and I will check the number of days between those two dates. And very often there is something that'll pop up and it doesn't even make sense. 300 days, whatever the case may be. And it's because the format of the date is wrong in one of the columns. And if you just read it in the format it's in, it isn't necessarily obvious because it might be like the 6th of March. And so the numbers turned around doesn't seem odd if you just in isolation look at that date. But if you look at that date in relation to the transaction date, it doesn't make sense. And then we can spot, oh, there's actually a formatting issue. But also that date comparison or the quick formula that you can use to just check the dates will also tell you if there's possible cut-off problems that you need to be aware of and pay attention to. All right. The next one is to check the tests that are performed. So check that all of the testing has been performed as it should have. So there's no empty little cells where the testing should be reflecting. It does happen, people. It does happen. If you think of a massive, let's say we're testing 40 items and you've got this grid with a lot of ticks in, it's very easy to miss that two tiny little blocks don't have their tick in them as they should. Very easy to miss it. So very important that we check that it is complete. Every little block that should be filled in is filled in. Tick marks are there and make sense. And my clerks used to mock me all the time because I used to say, where is your legend? Where is your legend? I can assume what your tick mark means, but I don't want to. I want you to tell me what your tick mark means. If you put a tick, does it mean yes? Does it mean I tried? What does it mean? I mean, the obvious answer would be yes, but to be honest, don't make assumptions because some other strange answers would, on the odd occasion, pop up. Okay, so legends are important to explain the tick marks if you're using tick marks. The numbers make sense, formatted correctly. They tie up where they need to tie up. And then also the notes and comments. When we are looking at the testing, definitely go and read the notes. The notes and the comments are usually the things that have gone wrong, the things that have gone outside of the test. So we must definitely check that everything was right, but then pay special attention to the notes or comments that are indicating something was actually wrong. And this is usually where we then have to go, okay, so now they've written a note or a comment because this transactions test didn't fall within what I was trying to achieve. So let's say it was I couldn't get the POD. Now the note needs to tell me how did I perform something alternative to tell me the transaction still happened. I don't want the note to say the POD was missing and that be the end of the story, because then how do I still know that the transaction happened? Then I want you to explain to me, because remember, the objective of the test, for instance, in our example, is occurrence of my revenue transaction. And if you say the POD was missing, I didn't meet my objective for that transaction. So how do I know it happened? And then there are alternatives that could be performed. For instance, going and ensuring the debtor paid the amount, fine, and that's written in the note and it's clear. And what I mean by it's clear, it doesn't just say the debtor paid the invoice. It says I want to say vouched, but I'm told that this is such an old school term. Vouched, verified, inspected the bank statement. There was a payment of XYZ amount on this date as payment towards this invoice. That's what I want to see on the working paper, to tell me you actually did audit work that proves that the transaction happened. And especially what happens when we have an explanation for management about why something went wrong. That's where we often fall short on gathering the evidence we need to meet the objective of the test. So often we will write management told us X, Y, and Z. Well, we won't write management. We'll write whoever discussed this with whoever person, and they indicated X, Y, and Z went wrong, and this is why the document is missing. Which is all well and good, and it does help us with assessing possible deficiencies in internal control. However, I'm still missing the objective of the test. And also, sometimes that explanation is XYZ said, in the case of this transaction, this other thing happened, and so this is this is why the transaction is not like the others, and this is what they used to raise the invoice. And then that's all it says. But the problem with that sentence is, then did we go and inspect whatever they used to ensure the transaction occurred? And does that actually prove the transaction occurred? Okay, so those are the things we're going to have to look out for when we are looking at the notes and the comments. Oh, I had a nice little block there, and then I went off on my tangent and didn't show the block. All right, references. Please do follow references through to wherever they are referenced to. So if my one working paper is referenced to another working paper, for instance, follow it through and ensure that that working paper is the one that is trying to be referenced, that it is actually in the file. Especially reference numbers should be reflected on the other working paper. And really the next point is the one that is probably my frustration often with files, where there is, for instance, a sum to be done to get to a certain number. So let's say we've got a reconciliation, and in this reconciliation, it references a number for receivable. I don't know. I don't want to choose receivables, but let's just go with the example. But just keep an open mind. Let's say it references receivables, right? And then I go to the receivables work lead sheet, and on that lead sheet, it doesn't have the number that's reflected on my recon. And then I say to the person who's done the section, how did you get this number? Why is it referenced here? And what did you do? And they say, if you add this number and this number on the lead sheet and then this number, and they're all mapped to different categories, then you will get to the number that I used in the recon. So now there's a few things that are the problem, because now when I did my initial review, I'm so stuck on where did I get my number? I also now didn't get the chance to establish, does that make sense? So now I have to redo this. So what should become common practice is, if something is made up of a few numbers on a working paper or a lead sheet, that sum should be written and clear on that lead sheet. And it sounds like a small and silly thing to make the staff do. However, just think about how many times someone has to go and add up the same numbers or figure it out. And imagine how much time that is. It was the clerk themselves. It's the next level of review. And let's say that's the senior on the job. Then the manager comes along and they review and they have to figure it out. Then the partner comes along and they have to figure it out. And then let's say it's quite a big job and there is an EQR. There's another person going to work it out. Imagine how much time is wasted for all of those people trying to figure out this thing, when if in instance one, when the person who did the work wrote on the lead sheet, here is the sum, and this number is referenced back to my working paper that I'm coming from with my recon on, imagine how much time could have been saved. And in that way, also at review 1, I am able to go, does it make sense that only those 3 numbers of the lead sheet are included in whatever recon I'm looking at? Okay. So please don't feel like you're being petty, insisting on someone writing a sum on the working paper. I once had a partner and he used to say, if he can't see the number on the working paper, it's not good enough. He doesn't want to pick up his calculator. He doesn't want to highlight things. He doesn't want to do anything. You must show him. That is the end of the story. Okay. And also, again, write out the sum, not just the total, so people know what the sum is made of. And then lastly, when we're reviewing the working papers, we'll look at, is the conclusion appropriate? So does it make sense? So if we found some exceptions, did we deal with exceptions appropriately? Or does it now influence the conclusion on the working paper? Talking about dealing with exceptions, we want to also make sure that if there are exceptions or errors or misstatements, whatever you want to call them, do they need to be accumulated across the section? And what that means is if we had multiple working papers testing the same assertion, so you might find this often in a section like let's say a receivables, because there's multiple categories of receivables. We get the trade receivables, we might get things like deposits or prepayments, things like that. So you have multiple categories and they all get tested differently, but all of them, for instance, there's multiple tests on the valuation of these amounts. And then we come up with errors across multiple working papers, and they're all speaking to the value of receivables, which is reflected as a line on my statement of financial position. And so I should add those misstatements up before I can conclude, for instance, it's trivial or not trivial. And what will be a common thing that happens in the section is the person will conclude on each working paper it's trivial, when in fact, if they were to add them all up, it's not trivial and it should have gone collectively to the overs and unders schedule. Okay, so first we consider, do we need to accumulate across the section? Could happen in any section. We follow through to the overs and unders schedule. So where there are misstatements identified, go and follow them through to wherever we should have put them. If you do not do this, there's a very big possibility that when you get to reviewing the overs and unders schedule, it isn't the complete schedule. Okay, so what you do need to do is follow it through, and this is to ensure that our overs and unders schedule is actually complete by the end of the audit. What we are going to look at when we're looking at the overs and unders schedule and whether this misstatement that we identified in the section we're reviewing is it going to the correct accounts? Remember, we're dealing with also inexperienced staff who might not have 100% handle on journal entries, making sure it's correct accounts, etc. And by correct accounts, also check the lead sheet it is mapped to. So sometimes there might be an account called manufacturing costs, but that manufacturing costs account is sitting in operating expenses and it should have been in cost of sales, and we have an error that needs to adjust cost of sales. Then putting it to manufacturing expenses is the wrong thing. Okay, if that was the misstatement that we identified on this working paper. Make sure also that the description, I specifically wrote it this way, accurate and descriptive description. Okay, accurate as in on point, what was the misstatement? Does it tell the correct story? And a descriptive description means it tells me what the problem was. It doesn't just say error in cost of sales, error in expenses. It says this is what the error arose from. Okay. And then a debit and credit is the right way, because this is often signs get mixed up, people. I myself have passed journals the wrong way, and I still have to think about many times. I have to pause for something and go, what would I debit? What would I credit? So check the debits and credits is the right way. And then also the category of misstatement is correct. And this is an important point because often we don't categorize our misstatements. And what I mean by category is that factual, projected, or judgmental misstatement. And this is important because when we get to the end of the audit, there's, I want to say, a call to be made about whether we are approaching materiality, not approaching materiality, whether we're okay. Also, when we are reporting our overs and unders to management, and the requirement in the standards is we must request management correct all misstatements, it should also be clear to them where we have a judgment. So it is something that is our judgment, which they may have a different judgment about. And also for something like projected errors, which is the errors that are coming out of our sampling, for instance, where we have projected an error across a population. It's not a true error. Management should also be able to know that so that they don't go, cool, we're going to correct everything without the knowledge that this is a projected error. So it could be a completely different error that they are actually dealing with in their accounting records. And then also, very important, the overs and unders is to make sure that the journal is referenced to the working paper where it was identified. So this, I know it seems like it is something you would do at the finalization stage, but what you're doing with this, let's call it a procedure when you review the account auditing file, is you are making sure that that overs and under schedule is complete. But while you are there, you are making sure the information is complete and accurate for inclusion there in your finalization. Okay. If there are any management letter points or report to management items, I've put both in case someone's not familiar with alternative terms, but an MLP or management letter point or an RTM, a report to management item. If something is identified on the working paper that needs to be reported, follow it through to the report. Again, to ensure that our report to management is complete, that the descriptions are correct and detailed. Remember, this is something management needs to understand what we are talking about, what the problem was. And again, we have inexperienced staff sometimes writing things and it's not clear. You have people not sitting in the hot air balloon next to you, so they autofill, and therefore the description on the item is not sufficient for management to understand what went wrong. And then also to ensure the recommendation actually makes sense and it is actionable. So the recommendation will actually work to address this problem. It isn't generic. It isn't I want to say wasted words. And it is something that management could validly implement to make or to address the misstatement or problem gap in the internal controls that we have identified. Right, a special little note on journals. So journals, I think probably in every single Get Ahead series and course we mention journals, but again, to mention it in the review course because it is always a significant risk and it is often something that we get not exactly spot on. Journals, just look out for journals that are not tested, they just explained. So what I mean by that is a journal that we write as audit evidence, the client raised this journal because X, Y, and Z. That is not testing the journal, that is explaining what the journal is about. And the testing of the journal is wrapped up in why was it passed, because that'll tell us where to go to actually do the testing. So the actual, okay, so the journal was raised because they wanted to raise a provision for X, Y, and Z. Okay, so let me go and look at the provision for X, Y, and Z. And how did they get to that provision? And what did they use? And does it make sense? And is there hard evidence that I can use for this provision? Okay. If the testing is performed elsewhere, make sure it is properly referenced and follow the reference through to be sure. So journals, everyone, I know you're going to be surprised by this next remark. There are debits and there are credits to a journal. I know, I was blown away when I realized this, right? So, because we have a debit and a credit, what often happens across teams is they will test the journal in one area only, which makes sense. It is much more efficient to test both the debit and the credit for the same journal in one place instead of testing it across two places and getting the same evidence. You're not getting more comfort, you're just using the same evidence twice and documenting something twice. So there's no problem with that. But what does seem to happen is the person testing the debit will reference to the person testing the credit. The person testing the credit references to the working papers for the person checking the debit. And what results is no one has tested either the debit or the credit. So it is really important to follow through references. So if someone says this journal was tested in this section, go there immediately to check. You are not going to remember when you get to the section. And that section also says this was tested in that section. It's not, you are highly unlikely to remember. So it's best to follow the reference through when you get there, especially in the case if you are one of those firms that have a big journal recon to show where things are tested. So these are standard journals, and this is how these are incorporated in testing. These are the unusual journals. This is where we've tested these. These are material journals, and so we've done this. These are the year-end journals. Often, there are references there to where items have been tested, and that person doing the recon will assume that in a section, a certain, let's say the inventory journal is tested in inventory. And then the person doing the testing in that section might miss that journal and it doesn't get tested. So always make sure you do follow these things through because things happen, life happens. All right. Then make sure the actual evidence was obtained, as I've already touched on. And calculations, just a quick one on calculations, is when there is a calculation behind a journal, that they didn't just go to the client's calculation and go, cool, the calculation agreed to the journal. Because what was behind the calculation and the documentation and the evidence behind the client's calculation is where the true testing needs to happen. Because that calculation is, again, if we're just using the client's calculation, that is another document prepared by the client we are using as evidence of what the client did, if that makes sense. Okay. Just a very quick one I'm going to just point out here on an Excel sheet. This is not in your material, so you can just follow along in the on the screen. But what I talk about when we do the execution is things like this. So don't feel overwhelmed when you open a working paper. So things like, does my source tie in with other things I've done? So here, the clerks have said, we used the general ledger as the source of our testing. And then in the completeness assessment, it talks about my general ledger. So that makes sense. And then I will also assess whether we we sufficiently addressed completeness and accuracy of our source. And then the objective, making sure that, again, what was my risk? What was the level of risk? What do I expect to see? Also, things like, I'm not going to go through all of it, but things like sample size 6. Do I have 6 items tested? And what I would advise also is to highlight the numbers, especially when it's a really large working paper, let's say 40 items, or often we will test split things like this where we have lines for material and lines for the sample, or lines for this was the original sample, this is our extended sample, and they all number differently. So we just need to check that the total number we've tested is correct, and also just highlight, because computer skills are a challenge, people, and sometimes someone accidentally deletes a row and you'll go, oh cool, it ends at 6 and so we've tested 6, but meanwhile number 3 is hidden or deleted and so we didn't actually test 6, we've tested 5. All right, so very important. Audit work performed. They've shown us what steps are we supposed to see on this working paper. We'd go check the work program, see that what those steps are, and does that actually filter through to the steps that we have performed on this working paper? Are we testing the right thing? Do those steps actually address these risks that we are trying to address? And then things like, you'll remember I said, making sure the source and the information ties up. So here it says general ledger information. Did we use the general ledger as our source? Yes, we did. Does this make sense the way these descriptions are coming through? Yes, actually it does. They are quite consistent. I've looked at the GL. They make sense in the context of what I've seen in the GL. Here it says, as per supporting documents, this is what they did. But my question then would be, what supporting document? But hey, presto, this person has put there, we are using the supply invoices as our supporting documents. So excellent. I now know exactly what they have done. Here is what I was talking about with the grid and making sure the little blocks don't have something missing, because now if you just take a quick look, everything looks fine, but then meanwhile, there's one little block having a little issue. Then we can see we also have some notes on this working paper, and this is when we would go and we would look at What are the notes and what does it mean? And especially in the case where we have a note like this, for instance, I would check, was it something that needed to be extrapolated, or is it something also that needs to be accumulated across multiple working papers? Okay, so those are the things we would look at with the actual working paper. And here, of course, is my legend and my conclusion. But I do hope that at least some of these little arrows and this will link that slide to what we're actually going to do when we're reviewing the working paper. Okay, moving swiftly along is what do we do now when we get to finalization? Also, remember, everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. It is going to be helpful to everyone. Otherwise, I'm just going to assume I'm doing the most wonderful job and you all understand exactly what I'm speaking about. You're like, this is the best training about a file review I've ever sat in. I'm just blown away by how much I've learned. Okay. All right. When we review finalization, there's various things we do review in finalization. So I'm going to touch on some of them. It might not be all of the items, but there are certain things that I feel are important to look at and that I specifically focus on. Things like subsequent events is number one, where is the evidence? So what I often find with a subsequent event is I have a working paper that says no events there's no events that have been identified. It just says none identified, none identified, none identified, and there's no evidence. It doesn't tell me how do you know there was nothing identified. When it says review the minutes, what minutes did we inspect to make sure there were no subsequent events? Okay, things like that. So if you see a working paper subsequent events that just filled with the comment none identified, no, not good enough. Tell me what you did. And if you go read, often there's a step that says, what does management do to identify subsequent events? And then it'll say none identified, but that's not the question. The question was, what does management do? Right. Then the events, for events that are identified, what was the financial statements impact? So did they document what the impact was? So is it an adjusting or a non-adjusting event? Is it disclosable? Is it something that happened after year end, is applicable to after year end, and isn't required to be disclosed, and therefore we're okay with it? So I want to see some sort of assessment on there. And did we do the disclosure testing? So if it was something that needed to happen in the financials, for instance, so something that needed to be disclosed or adjusted, was that done? And where is the testing of that? And then the date of performance is very important for subsequent events. The date of performance of subsequent events needs to be at the end of the audit. So, and not just at the end of the audit, up until practically the audit report date. So a lot of firms will have a requirement to retest the subsequent events to the date of the audit report. And remember, in our financials and in our audit reports, the expectation and the requirement is to test the subsequent events to the date of the audit report. That is what we are saying to everyone, is we've tested subsequent events to the date of the audit report. So the date of performance, please note performance, not the date of review. You can sign it off on the last day, but the date of performance is what should be as close to the audit report as possible. Then in terms of going concern, we want to, at the finalization stage, what most methodologies will do is actually assess the going concern upfront. It doesn't actually make sense to only assess going concern at the end, because if there is a going concern problem and you need to prepare on a, let's say, liquidation basis, what is the point of that whole audit you just performed if you get to finalization and now you discover there's a going concern problem? Okay, so the bulk of the work is sitting in planning, but what we do need to assess at finalization is that anything change in the audit to indicate that our assessment that we did at the planning stage is wrong. So when you read those documents, what you're looking for is, was there any change? And you will have reviewed the execution of the file by this point. So you should also have taken note, was there anything that indicates a going concern problem that I now expect to see in this document? And if I did find something, I should have immediately followed it through as I have harped on about this principle throughout this whole training. Then did we consider the impact on the audit report? So if I do have a going concern problem, if it is a material uncertainty and something has to happen in the audit report, go to the audit report and go and look, did my paragraph get inserted into the audit report? Okay, very important, because you would be shocked at how many times the working paper says, here is a problem, and the financial statements don't say one thing about it. And then, yeah, follow the conclusion through to the audit report. Reviewing reviewing the audit report. So here I would say, so we usually have a document in our finalization that is something along the lines of assessing what type of report we should issue, as well as the content of that report. What you do need to do is do not assume that someone went and typed up the correct audit report automatically. Do not assume that whatever the stock standard thing is that pops up in those caseware financials, if that is where you're drafting it, don't assume that that's got everything it needs to. That still requires you to actually tailor it. So when you are reviewing, check the audit report, check that the opinion is appropriate and correct, and ties in with the finalization documentation. The paragraphs that are required, as well as the wording of those paragraphs, is in line with whatever the guidance is. In South Africa, we have SARPS 3, and SARPS 3 has example reports in it and specific wording that we are required to use. We make sure that those paragraphs have the correct wording and they are in there. So like I said, if there's a material uncertainty, is the paragraph in there? Does it say the right thing? Sometimes that wording is not mandated. It's something we have to, I will say, come up with because there's an issue. Then make sure it's appropriate, that the person has written something that actually makes sense. Ensure, this is going to sound so silly, but more than once, the year end has gone wrong. And this will often happen where we are actually drafting our audit report outside of our caseware financials. And so we have, let's say, a Word template that the firm is using, and the year end doesn't get fixed. And just think about the implications of that, how it looks. It looks like we're issuing a report that is on the wrong set of financials. So make sure the year end is correct, the signature area is correct. In South Africa, our signature area is mandated in quite an odd place. Well, it seems odd to me, I guess, which is in the Code of Professional Conduct. But the signature area is actually mandated how it should show up in South Africa specifically. In the standards also, it says you should have certain information that is in there. So check the signature area, and if there's any variations to the report that should be taken into account, things like your other information. Other information paragraphs are the wording changes depending on when you get that other information, or if you haven't gotten it yet and you're still expecting it. So it's very important that we check those little wording issues and the variations that are applicable to our client. So when you're reviewing, you must check these things because they are very small things that often get missed. The evaluation of misstatements, when we're looking at this document or this working paper, we're going to check, was there a reason to change the materiality? The standards talk about confirming that your planning materiality remains appropriate. It talks about confirmation. It doesn't say go and perform a brand new final materiality calculation. So that is why I'm saying, was there a reason to change the materiality? And you will have reviewed the file up until this point. So if there was something that went massively wrong, or maybe no one noticed at that point, and maybe you also didn't pick it up, and now you look at the overs and unders journal, not the overs and unders, the corrected journals, and our base has been adjusted for the materiality by a massive amount. Perhaps this is where we pick up, oopsie, our final materiality should actually be a different number. And that should show on the working papers that are available in the products. It will show you a different range from which you can select. And that range will be out from the one you used originally. And hopefully your number doesn't fall outside of that. But if it does, then we have to look back at, do we need to now go and do extra work, which is likely. All right, then conclusion on the overs and unders. We want to check if they are individually material in aggregate. Do we need to change the audit plan? And were the misstatements as a result of error or fraud? So those are the general things that we would look at, because we need to conclude on material individually or in aggregate, and then change in the audit plan. So was there a risk that we've missed and we need to go back and look at it? And error or fraud, obviously very important for our assessment, and again, probably would result in a change in audit plan if we picked up a whole lot of fraud. Why there is a little asterisk there is because please do not forget that our conclusion on overs and unders includes disclosure overs and unders. So do not ignore disclosure overs and unders errors. There should be a working paper in finalization also gathering the disclosure overs and unders. Also requires us to conclude on those things, all right, individually and in aggregate, as well as assessment of change in audit plan, and is it an error or is it fraud? Management representation letter. We want to check that this one is complete. In ISA 580, everyone, there is an appendix, and what Helen has done is I have actually written myself a little note about the paragraph numbers, just so I don't have to always go to 580, although I will tell you I often have to go to the standard that I'm referencing. But ISA 580 has both the name of the standard as well as the paragraph reference, which requires specific representation from management. So it's a good completeness check, a check for the wording. Also things like, is it on the client letterhead? Is it appropriately signed? Very important, is the date on the rep letter as near as practicable to the audit report date? That is a requirement of the standards. It must be as near as practicable to the audit report date. It cannot be after the date of the audit report. And then very important again, have we attached the overs and unders? They have to be attached to the management representation letter in terms of the standards. Why is there an asterisk? Anyone want to guess? Because disclosure overs and unders also need to be attached to that overs and unders list, not just the numbers. Right, and then other things we'll check is, does the final analytical reflect as expected? So the story that's being told on the analytical is the one that I've seen through the file after my review, and have the team signed the declarations they're required to sign. In terms of the timing of reviews, we have planning throughout as well as final, and then, yes, everyone, Helen did in fact write final review because we will go through, as we mentioned when we talked about phases of review, planning, execution, as well as final, and then final, because there's often between the date of us finishing the audit and the date of us actually issuing the audit report, there's usually a period of time. But what does need to be redone at the final stage is that we need to make sure that the subsequent events dating is correct, the audit report date the audit report date is correct, as well as that management rep letter being as near as practicable to the audit report date. If you have a client that is quite the dilly-dallyer, so they really take very long to sign their documentation, there is a need for us to go back to that file and reassess the evidence that we've gotten at final stage. All right, the victory lap, the clearing, we're almost done, everyone, and then we're going to take a, well, we're not going to take a break, but we are going to do something pretty fun. But don't skip the clearing of queries. It seems like, okay, guys, I've told you what to do. You're going to go do it, and I can trust that you're going to do your jobs. And yes, that may be true. However, queries are also part of your staff training. And if you do not tell someone what they're doing wrong and then check that they are able then to do it right, we were missing quite an essential, a very essential training tool that we have available to us. Because then we can see, did they understand when I gave them the review query, what was going wrong? Also, I would say when you give the queries, what I would advise if you have time is to always try to explain the query to the person you are giving it to, because then they are much more likely to get it right the first time they clear it than if you leave them to figure it out themselves first round and you're just going to come back and have to explain it anyway. Speaking of explaining. When you have to return a query after round one, definitely, especially if you didn't have the discussion first time, make sure that you explain it appropriately, explain exactly what you want, and explain the why of it. So they understand why they need to do it, they understand the principle, and they're less likely to have the same error going forwards. Make sure when you are clearing the queries, the changes made are correct and the changes giving rise to, and there may be changes that give rise to further queries. So those are where they make the change. And now you read it again and you think, wow, now I can see there's actually a bigger issue here. Make sure you don't skip the step of clearing the queries. Okay. If you do have a challenge, there are in caseware, it's very handy to go and look at the different versions of a document if you want to see or remind yourself, what was my problem? What did the document look like before? And what have they changed it to now? You can compare the two versions. It's a very helpful tool to use. A note on the raising of queries is to remember that everyone is going to follow the prior. So what I mean by that is when we feel like, oh gosh, this is such a silly query, or you know what, they've done this, it's too late, I'm not going to have them fix it. Remember that next year everyone's likely to do the same thing because everyone follows what was done in the prior year. Questions can lead to further queries. So what I would also advise is when you're writing your query or your question, explain why you're going to ask the question, because it's going to remind you as well, why did I ask this question? I had a concern in mind that made me write this question. Okay. Use language understandable for the level you're giving the query to. So don't write in very big technical words when you are dealing with someone who's inexperienced, when you're dealing with someone who's not far enough in their studies to understand it. And also, to be honest, when we use those big technical terms, it's very hard to know exactly what I'm supposed to do. Even for me, I'd rather go and convert something from ISA language sometimes to something simpler. Even for myself, I try to explain it in simpler terms just to make it make sense in my brain. Use appropriate referencing. So if it's a cell number, XYZ, row this, use appropriate referencing so the person can see exactly where the problem is. So there's also working electronically now is helpful. You can highlight on the working papers, use the yellow, you can have a question number, etc. So use appropriate referencing so somebody can find exactly what you need them to do and change. Remember, they are not sitting next to you. So, and also you have to clear afterwards. So write the query to explain enough that they know what's required, write enough that you're going to remember what you wanted them to do and why, and so that you can clear it easier afterwards. Try to write the query as what you see on the working paper. So what was the fact? What is the thing that is wrong? So what have they written? Then go to what is your problem and what needs to change. And then for questions, include why you are asking, as mentioned. And the reason we write what is on the working paper and what is my problem with it, because that will also help you to track what you are wanting them to fix. A quick one on considerations of EQRs is, well, firstly, what is an EQR? An EQR is an engagement quality review. This is an additional level of review that is performed on certain engagements. So there may be some of you sitting here in the training today that have never experienced an EQR. It is not necessarily the most common thing for certain jobs, like listed jobs. An EQR is required, but then the firm will also have specific criteria of when to perform an engagement quality review. So the engagement quality reviewer is usually, well, it will be someone who's not part of the audit team. So it can be another partner in the firm, it can be someone external to the firm, but it must be someone with enough authority to say to the partner, no, you shall not sign the audit report. So the EQR, and in this case, I'm referring to the reviewer, the EQR is the person that must give sign-off before the partner is allowed to sign the audit report. And what I just want to mention is consider that this person isn't with the team all the time. So when you are dealing with an EQR, keep in mind that there's an extra level of communication that needs to happen. They need to be informed of the problems you have found. the problems you found in your review, the extra work you've had to make the team do. They need to be aware of those issues, and especially significant matters that they need to pay attention to. Also, notify them when planning is done, the queries are cleared before they review, and ask for clarification on their queries when it is needed. Because guaranteed, they are also sitting there, like you, wanting you to clear the query appropriately so they only have to do it once, just like you would like with your clerks. Okay. And then communicate when sections are completed, and that client communication includes that an EQR needs to be done, because an EQR adds a whole chunk of time to any job you are doing. And so it's very important to manage the client expectations, to say, listen, client, we have to have an EQR done in terms of our quality control or our quality management policies. And so there's going to be a bit of an extra review level. This is going to help with the quality and make sure we're making the right decisions. And so we are going to have to work out a better timeline for the deadline, etc. Whatever the case may be, just managing the client's expectations. All right. Now, what we would like everyone to do is to please do our post-series survey, because this is our last session of your level 3 sessions. Thank you, UNA. UNA has posted in the meeting chat, the link to the survey has been posted. So if you wouldn't mind just taking 5 minutes to go through that survey. UNA, do you want me to open it and just let everyone see what it's about?
Yeah, I think you can do that. Thanks,
Okay,
William.
perfect. All right, so this is what the survey looks like. So if everyone can click on it, and we can just indicate, for instance, what level you are. Even if you've only attended today's session and you haven't attended all 3 levels, please go ahead and fill in the survey. It's still, every bit of feedback helps us to improve and learn and just get better at what we're doing. And hopefully that helps you and those after you. All right, so what experience level are you? What is the most beneficial thing that you've gotten out of the level 3 series? And again, if you've only done today, yay for me, because I guess then your answer is going to be reviewing the audit file. Okay, so please just pick, or if you have another thing that's really stuck out for you. Then it's how often would you prefer the live sessions to be? What works best for you? Once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month? What would help you the most? This year, the live sessions were presented on a Friday afternoon. And do you prefer a Friday morning or an afternoon session? I'm going to guess what I think everyone will say there, but please just be honest. I think some of you might also have a lot of work to do in the morning, so an afternoon is great for you. Then would you prefer to have the interactive sessions to start in Jan, Feb, March, or April? So the interactive sessions is these sessions like we're chatting to you now. And then for future level 3s, would you prefer the sessions to end in March, April, May? So obviously now we're in March and we're ending our sessions now. This is the last one. So would you like it to rather end later? What would suit your timetable? And then what topics do you think we should also cover in level 3? So is there some other suggestion, other things you would like us to cover? And would it be beneficial in future for some of the level 3 theory covered in the live sessions to be rather included as recordings or e-learning that you watch before the live session? Okay, so once you have answered those and typed in what you need to type in, please submit your responses. So I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes to fill in the survey. right, I see. Thank you so much for telling me you are done. um, let's take a comfort break. So you also have time between finishing the survey. You can also just have a small comfort break before we do the next part, which is quiz time, everyone. So do come back. It is quiz time and it is fun. It is not a boring audit quiz. Okay, so let's do quiz time. So let's take UNA, what do you think about 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think 10 minutes is good. And then we'll do the quiz and then the breakout thereafter. So there's still lots happening.
All right, awesome. So at 18 minutes past 3, we'll come back, we will do our little quiz, and then we will do the breakout after we do the quiz.